Hello, it's Mr. Koch joining you from it's my oldest daughter's room, so the quietest room in the house right now. So you may hear a baby trying to sleep in the background. If you hear that, I apologize, but hopefully it won't be too distracting. Today we're going to wrap up the Civil War, bring this whole thing to an end. Just to recall your memories, right? The war started with the attack on Fort Sumter. We had the first real battle at Bull Run. Eventually, fighting spills out throughout the East and the West. In the East, the Confederates were rather successful. Meanwhile, in the West, the Union was successful, capturing the entire Mississippi. Today, we'll talk a little bit about the Union winning the war and then kind of a quick wrap up of some of the results of the war. So let's start off with, sorry about that. Let's start off with Lincoln replacing McClellan. You might recall that McClellan's Peninsula campaign failed. He was basically completely outgeneraled by Robert E. Lee, even with his plans. McClellan was not able to decisively defeat Lee or finish off his army, so Abraham Lincoln replaced him with a General Burnside. General Burnside proceeded to lose at a place called Fredericksburg. One part of Fredericksburg, the Confederate Army was up on a railroad embankment, and as the Union Army charged, the Confederates mowed them down, killing like 1,000 soldiers in like 2 minutes. One of the deadliest sites of fire, um, intense fire during the entire war. Eventually, we'll talk a little bit about Fredericksburg when we get to Gettysburg. So after Burnside lost at Fredericksburg, Lincoln replaced him with a General Hooker. And General Hooker proceeded to invade the South, and he lost at a place called Chancellorsville. So Lincoln keeps having general after general replaced, and these generals continue to lose, unable to bring a decisive defeat to Robert E. Lee, who's in charge of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Eventually, Lee then reinvades the North. Similar to his idea with the invasion at Antietam, Lee wants to give the Virginia farmers a break. He wants to threaten the North. He wants to threaten Washington, D.C. He wants to scare the northern civilian population. He wants to find needed supplies. And so, for a whole bunch of different reasons, Lee once again changed his strategy from defense to offense. And in 1863, summer of 1863, he invades the North. This would lead to the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in our very own Pennsylvania. Sorry, guys, we're not going to go this year, but I really hope someday you get a chance to go see Gettysburg. It's a really cool battlefield, and the cyclorama and lots of different things are pretty neat there. So, at the Three-Day Battle of Gettysburg, basically a Confederate Army and Union Army fight for a series of 3 days, and finally on the third day, the Confederates order a charge at the center of the Union line. And it's probably Lee's biggest mistake of the war. He thinks that's where the Union line is weakest, and in the end, the advance fails, and the Union Army manages to defeat the Confederates, and they're forced to retreat. Most historians consider Gettysburg to be the turning point of the war. Again, I made a little bit of an argument for Vicksburg the other day. Vicksburg happened the day before this, uh, or sorry, the day after this, but surrender at Vicksburg did. But anyway, most historians consider Gettysburg the turning point because after Gettysburg, there would never again be an invasion of the North. The Confederates just can't ever quite muster the forces or the supplies or the momentum to once again attack. In addition, after losing at Gettysburg, any chance of foreign help disappeared. So if you can think back to the American Revolution, when the Americans won in Saratoga and Europeans came to help America, it's sort of the opposite of this for the Confederates at Gettysburg. When the Confederates lose at Gettysburg, neither France or Britain nor other European countries think they're going to win, so they basically get no help from those official help from those foreign countries. But once again, Meade from the Union, he was in charge of the Union forces at Gettysburg. He didn't finish Lee once again. So we see another Union army refusing to finish off Lee, even though they won the battle. They allow Lee to march home, bringing all his wounded and stuff with him. And so uh, Union general after Union general after Union general just refuses to finish off Lee. So even though it's a turning point, the Union doesn't completely defeat the Confederacy, and the war is going to go on for another 2 years. Excuse me. Eventually, in 1864, after all the success along the Mississippi, um, Lincoln would put Grant in charge of the entire Union Army. He does this in 1864. And Grant is going to bring with him the um, sort of no surrender mentality, and continually go after the Confederates and eventually drive the Union forces to victory. So in 1864, late 1864 and 1865, he begins the Wilderness Campaign. This is a lot of fighting that occurred in the forests and the woods around Richmond. And after many, many days of fighting, eventually Grant would capture Richmond. Meanwhile, working from Tennessee and working down through towards Georgia, another Union general working underneath Grant, a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman, commits what they call total war. And so he basically takes his army from Tennessee, a Union army from Tennessee, and he spreads them out like several miles wide, and they literally just destroy everything they come across. They burn farm fields, they burn barns, they kill livestock, they destroy railroads and bridges and every single thing that they can find. They just destroy it. And this comes to be called total war. And William Sherman becomes kind of controversial for this, gets criticized for this, but he basically says, look, we're going to win this war. We're going to take the will to fight out of the enemy by just destroying everything we come across. He eventually came across Atlanta. People in charge of Atlanta surrendered the city to him, and he wound up attacking parts of the city anyway. And in fact, then the people leaving Atlanta, trying to escape Atlanta, put Atlanta to the torch. And so Sherman is held responsible for the burning of Atlanta. In fact, if you want to get punched in the jaw, you should probably bring up William Sherman in an Atlanta pub someday. And I pretty much guarantee you're going to make some people angry because he's definitely seen as a villain by the South. At the same time, he really did take the will to fight out of the South and just, um, completely committed to fighting and destroying anything that can help the enemy. Eventually, Grant captured Richmond, as I mentioned before. He then proceeds to chase Lee from Richmond, and eventually, at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee decides enough is enough. He can't just keep running from Grant. He knows that Grant's a different kind of general than the other generals, that he just keeps coming after him and coming after him. And so he doesn't want to lose any more men. And on April 9th, 1865, at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant officially. And he was treated with much respect by Grant, despite the fact that Grant was the commander of the winning army. He basically allowed Lee's guys to just swear not to be disloyal again and go home. He also fed them and gave them medical care and that kind of stuff too. So Lee appreciated how gracious Grant was to him. Another kind of funny story about the surrender is that there was a guy named Wilbur McLean, and Wilbur McLean owned a small farm near Bull Run. And so when the first Battle of Bull Run happened, Wilbur McLean moved his family away from Bull Run because he thought it'd be too dangerous there, too much fighting in that region, and he moved to Appomattox Courthouse. And so one day, Wilbur McLean gets this knock on his door, and in April of 1865, and it's some officer saying, "Hey, we'd like to use your house for the official surrender of the Confederate Army." And McLean says, "Yeah, no problem. You guys can use my house." And so that's where Lee and Grant met, was in this Wilbur McLean's house. And so the kind of saying goes that the war that started in Wilbur McLean's backyard ended in his front parlor. And again, that was April 9th of 1865, Appomattox Courthouse. The effects of the war would be 620,000 killed. In fact, there's been some recent historical efforts that have that number even higher, but it's the deadliest war in American history. Just by comparison, we lost some 400,000 men in World War II, 60,000 in Vietnam. I believe we're up to maybe 7,000 in Iraq, Afghanistan. So, just by comparisons, it was the deadliest war in U.S. history and killed a lot of people. The South was ruined. They were ruined economically, and it would be many, many years for the South to catch up. The South would remain more impoverished than the North for decades to come, essentially. And then, arguably, the best effect of the entire war was the 13th Amendment. Shortly after their surrender, the Congress began moving through Congress an amendment to the Constitution to end slavery. So the 13th Amendment ended slavery. And this now led to the question of, how do we reunite the country? How do we bring the country back together? And that will take us to a period we call Reconstruction, where basically the North and the South try to figure out how to rebuild the South, even though many at the North were mad at the South for the war and wanted to blame them and punish them. And it's going to lead to impeachment, and it's going to lead to all kinds of troubles for the people of the South and the North as they wade through trying to put the country back together. So that's pretty much the end of the war. Lincoln keeps replacing generals until he finally gets one who, won't quit until he wins, and that's Grant. Um, Part of Grant's forces are led by a guy named William Sherman, who commits this total war through the South that becomes very controversial, but certainly was effective at defeating the enemy. Eventually, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, and as I mentioned, 620,000 killed, the South ruined, and the 13th Amendment. So appreciate you guys listening, and if you could just do whatever other assignments are on Google Classroom, I'd appreciate it. And hope everybody stays safe and well.